In the previous video, I explained that the fake pandemic is merely a front for tackling the three existential problems we face: overconsumption, overpopulation, and overabuse. In this video, I will focus on overconsumption, more specifically on how overconsumption is addressed by using the pandemic as a front. To reduce consumption, you have to prevent people from shopping, which requires that you prohibit or at least limit people from getting out of the house. But how do you keep people in the house for any length of time? By scaring them to death with an invisible virus that causes an illusory pandemic. Well, the pandemic has provided governments with the excuse they needed to declare emergency measures, impose quarantines, lockdowns or curfews, and keep people in the house for a couple of months or even longer in some cases. At the same time, essential businesses alone were allowed to stay open in order to limit people to buying only groceries and medicine. All other businesses were deemed non-essential and were closed. That has limited people's opportunity to consume anything other than food, drinks, and drugs. People still had the opportunity to buy online, but that was dampened by the fear of infection, limitations on transport, the closing of borders and therefore of international trade, the lack of internet banking and computer skills among the elderly especially, but also among the poor, the lack of money due to unemployment which skyrocketed during the quarantine, the fear of an uncertain economic future, and by the absence of impulse buying, which is responsible for at least a quarter of all purchases. To ensure that consumption is reduced even after the various quarantines, lockdowns and curfews were lifted, governments introduced the social distancing rule under the pretext that it is necessary to prevent the transmission of the disease, although there is no scientific evidence whatsoever to suggest this, even if there were a pandemic. Since the pandemic is a total fiction, however, and governments are well aware of this, as they are responsible for creating and sustaining the pandemic illusion, we can conclude that the lockdowns and the ensuing social distancing measure were intended solely as overconsumption reduction measures, which in turn reduce CO2 emissions and thus aid the decarbonization agenda and have a positive impact on the environment. In China alone, offline spending on goods and services declined during the lockdown by 33% and 34% respectively. Dining and entertainment dropped 64%, and travel decreased by 59%. After the lockdown was lifted and the social distancing measure was introduced, China's offline consumption decreased by over 1.2 trillion RMBs in the 3-month post-outbreak period, or 1.2% of China's GDP. In Europe, the US and elsewhere in the developed world, spending is down across all industries even more than in China due to longer lockdowns and the fact that they are nationwide and not just of one region, as was the case in China, where Wuhan alone suffered an extended lockdown. And also due to the economic consequences of the closing of industry, the ensuing unemployment, and the fear that household incomes will continue to fall in the coming months. That governments are serious about continuing to reduce consumption is made all the more obvious by the fact that malls have not been allowed to reopen, and that when they will be allowed to reopen, customers and staff will be forced to adhere to strict social distancing measures and to mandatory face masks. The social distancing rule will limit the number of customers allowed to shop at any one time, while the mandatory mask rule will take the fun out of shopping and will basically annihilate impulse buying. The lockdown was a form of blitzkrieg on consumption, while the social distancing and the facial mask rules will be akin to a Cold War on consumption. The former reduced consumption drastically in the short term, while the latter will reduce consumption steadily in the long term. Their combined effect will result in an annual reduction of consumption of at least 15 and at most 25%, enough to have a substantial impact on the decarbonization effort and an equally positive impact on the environmental protection effort, as well as on the effort to prevent the rapid depletion of vital natural resources. On the other hand, it will have a devastating and long-term effect on employment that, unless mitigated with massive job creation in essential industries and less polluting industries, will have to be addressed with a universal basic income for all people who have been displaced from their jobs by the system's move to reorganize the economy along the sustainability prerogative. Likewise, it has had a devastating impact on government debt, which was increased this year under the pretext of combating the pandemic more than it has increased during the past 10 years. This will give governments the pretext to increase taxes and impose austerity measures, which will further cripple consumer spending and thus depress consumption. Alternatively, an entirely new financial system will have to be devised, but whether there is the political will and unity to pull this off remains to be seen. What is clear is that the true purpose of the fake COVID-19 pandemic has been all along reducing the overconsumption of the developed world and, by extension, lowering the greenhouse gas emissions of the developed world. This is made plainly evident by the geographic spread and severity of the fake COVID-19 pandemic, which has hit hard only the most developed nations, namely the G20 nations, the world's biggest polluters. The G20 nations, which are responsible for 3/4 of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, have registered more than 80% of the global COVID-19 infections and more than 90% of all COVID-19 deaths. Since no virus is capable of political bias, we can conclude that the distribution and severity of the COVID-19 pandemic is a political construct. Having the highest consumption patterns and the highest CO2 emissions, the G20 nations are forced to make the biggest economic sacrifices. And that can only happen because the pandemic serves as a pretext and allows governments to hide the true agenda behind the principle of plausible deniability. In other words, governments will pretend and continue to pretend that they have acted in good faith and that to blame for the economic disaster is the pandemic itself and not the measures governments took to prevent a non-existent pandemic. Overconsumption is the developed world's problem and can only be addressed by imposing sacrifices on the developed world. And that is exactly what the developed world has done by taking the lead in this first engineered wave of an engineered pandemic. By the same token, overpopulation is the problem of the developing world and can only be addressed by imposing sacrifices on the developing world. And that is exactly what will happen during the second wave of this manufactured pandemic or through the introduction of mandatory vaccines. How the fake pandemic will be used to address the old age problem of the developed world and the overpopulation problem of the developing world, I will discuss in my next video.